The console screamed at Dorian Hayes in 3 different languages, none of them polite. Red warning lights strobed across the cockpit in patterns that seemed almost festive, which struck him as deeply inappropriate given the circumstances. He yanked the control yoke hard to port, felt the shuttle shudder in protest, and watched another chunk of his starboard engine tumble away into the amber void below. Well, he thought, that was probably important. The crystalline moon of Vareth 9 filled his viewport now, a sphere of pale glass and frozen oceans that would have been beautiful if it were not rushing toward him at terminal velocity. His navigation computer had given up offering suggestions approximately 4 minutes ago, and now simply displayed a message that read good luck in cheerful green letters. Dorian made a mental note to file a complaint with the manufacturer, assuming he survived long enough to find a complaint department. 3 days. 3 days since his distress beacon had begun its lonely song into the emptiness between stars, and not a single response had broken the static. The Merchant Coalition shipping lanes were supposed to run through this sector, heavy freighters laden with ore and processed materials making their slow journeys between the mining colonies and the inner worlds. He had mapped his rescue route specifically to intersect with their traffic patterns. What he had not accounted for was the possibility that everyone had simply decided to take a different path this month, leaving him alone with a dying ship and a moon that seemed personally offended by his presence. Another tremor ran through the hull. Dorian felt it in his teeth, in his bones, in the growing certainty that his next few decisions would determine whether he walked away from this or became a permanent feature of Vareth 9 landscape. He pulled up the sensor display with fingers that only trembled slightly and began scanning the surface below for anything that might qualify as a landing site. The results were not encouraging. Jagged spires of translucent crystal rose from the frozen sea like the teeth of some enormous beast, beautiful and absolutely lethal. Canyons carved through cliffs of pale glass, their depths lost in shadow. Nothing flat, nothing soft, nothing that suggested the universe had any interest in his continued survival. Then he saw it, carved into the face of a cliff that rose 300 meters above the frozen plain. A structure emerged from the crystal as though grown rather than built. Doorways and windows caught the light of the distant twin suns, throwing fractured rainbows across the canyon below. Platforms jutted from the cliff face at irregular intervals, and one of them, one blessed beautiful platform, appeared just large enough to accommodate his shuttle if he approached at exactly the right angle and did not make a single mistake. Dorian laughed, though it came out somewhat strangled. The universe, it seemed, had decided to give him a chance. A small chance. A chance that required him to thread his failing ship through a canyon of glass at high speed while his engines continued their dramatic suicide. But a chance nonetheless. He tightened his grip on the yoke and began his descent. The next 90 seconds existed outside of normal time. Dorian moved through them on pure instinct and accumulated training, making corrections he would not remember, avoiding obstacles he barely registered. Crystal walls flashed past on either side, close enough that he could see the veins of mineral deposits running through them like frozen lightning. His remaining engine coughed, stuttered, and somehow found enough dignity to keep burning. The platform grew in his viewport, rushing toward him with the inevitability of bad decisions made in desperate moments. Impact came with a sound like the end of the world. Metal screamed against crystal. Sparks fountained into the thin atmosphere. Dorian was thrown forward against his restraints hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs, then slammed back as the shuttle finally, mercifully, came to rest. Silence followed. Not complete silence, because his console continued to make unhappy clicking sounds, and something in the back of the cabin was hissing in a way that suggested imminent problems, but silence enough. Dorian sat in his pilot's chair and breathed. Just breathed. His hands were shaking now, trembling with the adrenaline that had no further use, and he let them shake because he was alive and that seemed worth celebrating. The celebration lasted approximately 30 seconds before practical concerns reasserted themselves. He ran through his survival checklist with the methodical focus of someone who had been trained for exactly this kind of disaster. Environmental suit integrity confirmed. Oxygen reserves at 6 hours and falling, which meant he needed to find an alternative source or accept a rather permanent nap. Emergency rations sufficient for perhaps a week if he was careful. Water recycler functional but making ominous gurgling sounds. Communicator producing nothing but static across all frequencies. Transmitter damaged but potentially repairable given time and tools and a miracle or two. The ship itself was finished. He knew that without needing to inspect the exterior. The sounds it had made during landing, the angle at which it now rested, the growing pool of something viscous spreading beneath the cockpit viewport all told the same story. His shuttle had given everything to deliver him safely, and now it was done. Dorian unsealed his restraints and stood, moving carefully through the tilted cabin toward the emergency hatch. His body ached in places he had not known could ache, a comprehensive catalog of bruises that would bloom into spectacular colors over the coming days. The hatch released with a pneumatic sigh, and he stepped out onto the crystalline platform into air that his suit immediately declared unfit for human consumption. The view stopped him cold. He stood 300 meters above a frozen sea that stretched to every horizon, its surface catching the light of the twin suns and throwing it back in countless shattered reflections. The crystal cliffs rose around him like the walls of some impossible cathedral, their pale surfaces threaded with veins of gold and silver that pulsed with their own inner light. Above, the amber sky darkened toward purple at its edges, and he could see the first stars beginning to emerge, unfamiliar constellations wheeling slowly overhead. It was beautiful, devastatingly, impossibly beautiful, and completely empty of anything that might help him survive. Dorian turned his attention to the structure carved into the cliff face. Up close, he could see details that the desperate approach had hidden. The doorways were tall, perhaps 3 meters high, framed by symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when he looked away and back again. The windows were not glass but empty spaces in the crystal, shaped with precision that suggested technology rather than nature. And there, beyond the nearest doorway, light moved. Not sunlight, not the fractured reflections of crystal catching the amber glow, something deliberate, something that pulsed with soft blue patterns, almost like breathing, almost like a heartbeat. He should be cautious. He knew this. Every protocol, every training manual, every story of first contact gone wrong told him to approach slowly, to observe, to gather information before making any move. His oxygen reserves told him a different story. 6 hours was not enough time for caution. 6 hours was barely enough time for hope. Dorian checked his equipment one final time. No weapons, because rescue pilots were not supposed to need them. Basic medical kit, emergency tools, a translation device that cheerfully informed him it contained linguistic databases for over 4,000 known languages, though it seemed unable to identify the symbols carved into the doorway. He squared his shoulders, took a breath of recycled air that tasted of metal and fear, and walked toward the light. The interior of the structure opened before him like a flower made of crystal and shadow. Walls rose to heights that his eyes could not fully measure, their surfaces covered in more of those shifting symbols, in patterns that suggested star charts or circuit diagrams, or perhaps both. The light he had seen from outside emanated from panels set into the ceiling far above, soft blue illumination that cast no shadows and seemed to come from everywhere at once. And there, standing at the far end of what he could only think of as an entrance hall, watching him with eyes that held the color of violet storms, stood the source of the pulsing light. She was humanoid but not human, that much was immediately clear. Her skin held the pale gray of dawn fog, smooth and somehow luminous, as though light lived beneath its surface. Hair the color of tarnished silver fell past shoulders held rigid with what might have been tension, or might have been simple alien posture. Long ears, elegantly pointed, swept back from her face and angled toward him in a way that suggested acute attention. And across her collarbones, her temples, the exposed skin of her arms, patterns of bioluminescence pulsed in sequences he could not begin to interpret. She was beautiful. She was terrifying. She was the first alien being he had ever encountered, and she was staring at him as though he had just tracked mud across her favorite carpet. Dorian raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. His translation device chirped uselessly in his ear, offering no assistance whatsoever. The woman's luminescent patterns shifted from blue to something cooler, more guarded, and she took a single precise step backward. He had found shelter. He had found life, and he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 2 minutes. Dorian stood with his hands raised while the gray-skinned woman watched him with those violet eyes, her bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors he had no framework to interpret. Blue shifting to green, shifting to something that might have been yellow if yellow could feel suspicious. His translation device continued its cheerful silence, apparently stumped by the complete absence of any sound from her direction. She communicated through light. The realization dawned on him slowly, piecing itself together from the rhythmic pulses across her skin, the way her patterns seemed to respond to his movements, the utter stillness of her lips. Her people had evolved beyond sound, beyond the crude vibrations of air that humans used to convey meaning. They spoke in luminescence, in frequencies and sequences that his eyes could see but his brain could not decode. Wonderful, Dorian thought. He had crashed on a moon inhabited by someone who spoke in colors, and his entire linguistic toolkit consisted of words. He tried speaking anyway, because silence felt worse than failure. His voice emerged rough from disuse and stress, filling the crystalline chamber with sounds that seemed almost offensive in their clumsiness. He told her his name. He explained that his ship had crashed, that he meant no harm, that he needed help. The words bounced off the walls and disappeared into the vast space above them, and she watched him produce them with an expression that might have been fascination or might have been the way someone watches a particularly confused animal attempt to solve a simple puzzle. When he finished, she tilted her head slightly, her long ears angled forward, then back. The patterns across her collarbones pulsed in a sequence that repeated 3 times before fading. Then she turned and walked deeper into the structure, pausing once to look back at him with what he chose to interpret as an invitation to follow. He followed. What else could he do? The observatory revealed itself in stages as she led him through corridors that curved and branched like the passages of some enormous shell. Chambers opened on either side, filled with equipment he could not identify, surfaces covered in more of those shifting symbols that rearranged themselves at the edges of his vision. Star maps dominated several rooms, vast 3-dimensional projections that showed galaxies he did not recognize spinning slowly in the pale light. She was a keeper of astronomical records, he realized, a curator of celestial knowledge. And this place, this impossible structure carved into crystal cliffs, was her library. She brought him to a chamber that contained what he eventually understood to be living quarters. A raised platform that might serve as a bed. Storage containers built into the walls. A window that looked out over the frozen sea far below, now gilded by the setting of one of the twin suns. She gestured toward the space with precise movements, patterns of soft blue pulsing across her skin, and then retreated to the doorway where she stood watching him with that same unreadable expression. He was being given a room, shelter, a place to exist within her domain that was not directly under her observation. The relief that washed through him was profound enough to weaken his knees. He would not die today, probably, unless the room was actually some kind of elaborate trap, but at this point he was willing to take that chance. The woman remained in the doorway for a long moment, her violet eyes cataloging him with scientific precision. Then her patterns shifted to something cooler, almost dismissive, and she turned and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Her footsteps made no sound. Of course they did not. Sound was not her medium. Dorian sat on the edge of the platform bed and allowed himself a small laugh that bordered on hysteria. He had made first contact with an alien species. He had been given shelter by a being who communicated through bioluminescence. He had absolutely no way to tell anyone about it because his transmitter was currently a collection of sparking components scattered across his ruined cockpit. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor that leaned toward the cruel. He slept eventually, exhaustion overriding fear, and woke to find a container of water and something that might have been food waiting just inside his doorway. She had entered while he slept, left her offerings, and retreated without waking him. The distance she maintained was precise, mathematical. He was beginning to understand that nothing about her was accidental. The days that followed established a pattern built on careful isolation. Dorian spent his mornings salvaging what he could from his ruined shuttle, dragging components through the crystalline corridors to a workspace she had indicated through gesture and pulsing light. His transmitter was damaged but not destroyed, and with time and patience and a few creative applications of emergency tools, he might coax it back to life. She watched him work sometimes, standing at a distance that never varied, her patterns cycling through colors he was learning to associate with curiosity. He began talking to her as he worked, filling the silence with observations and explanations and the occasional terrible joke. She did not understand his words, he knew that, but she seemed to appreciate the sound of them. Her patterns would shift when he spoke, sometimes toward warmer colors that he hoped indicated interest. He told her about Earth, about rescue pilots and shipping lanes, and the peculiar human habit of crashing expensive equipment in inconvenient locations. He told her about coffee, that sacred beverage without which human civilization would certainly collapse. Her ears would angle toward him when he spoke, those elegant pointed ears that marked her as undeniably alien despite the otherwise humanoid shape of her face and body. Learning her name took 3 days of increasingly creative charades. She could not speak it, of course, but she could show him the pattern that represented her identity, a sequence of blue and silver pulses that cascaded across her skin like falling stars. He tried to reproduce the sound he imagined it might make if light could speak, and what emerged from his mouth was something close to Xylith. She watched him say it, her head tilted, her patterns flickering with something that might have been amusement. Close enough, apparently. Xylith, the last keeper of forgotten star maps, the guardian of an empty observatory on a crystalline moon that no one visited anymore. He was beginning to understand the shape of her solitude, the weight of centuries spent alone with only the silence of space for company. Her people had been travelers once, cartographers of the void, mapping paths between stars that ships no longer sailed. They had built this observatory to house their accumulated knowledge, and they had left her behind to tend it. Why she remained, why she had not simply left when the travelers stopped coming, were questions he could not ask and she could not answer. The barrier between them was absolute, built from the fundamental incompatibility of their communication. He spoke in vibrations, she spoke in light. Neither could learn the other's language, not truly, not in any way that would allow for nuance or depth, but they could gesture. They could point and indicate and mime. They could draw symbols in the dust that gathered on unused surfaces and hope the other understood. When Dorian needed a particular tool for his transmitter repairs, he would sketch its shape, and she would disappear into the depths of the observatory, returning with something that was close enough to work. When she wanted to show him a particular star map, she would lead him to the chamber and pulse patterns at specific stars until he nodded his understanding. It was communication reduced to its most basic elements. Primitive, she probably thought it, insufficient, but it was something. The tremor came on the 5th day, a shuddering vibration that ran through the crystal walls and set the hanging light panels swaying. Dorian had experienced earthquakes before, the gentle rolling kind that occasionally troubled the tectonically active colony where he had trained. This was different. This felt like the moon itself was shifting, settling into some new configuration that might or might not include the structural integrity of the observatory. He was standing near Xylith when it happened, closer than usual because she had been examining his repair work with something that approached approval. The floor lurched. She stumbled, her careful balance disrupted by forces beyond her control. And Dorian, without thinking, without considering the implications, reached out and caught her arm to steady her. The reaction was immediate and visceral. She wrenched away from his grip as though his touch carried poison, her patterns exploding into shades of crimson and white that screamed alarm across every visible surface of her skin. Her violet eyes went wide, her long ears flattening back against her skull, and she retreated 3 steps before her back met the wall and she could retreat no further. Dorian stood frozen, his hand still extended, his mind racing to understand what he had done wrong. He had touched her, that was all. A simple steadying gesture that any human would have appreciated. But she was not human, and touch was not simple, and the horror in her eyes told him that he had just violated something fundamental to her existence. She fled. There was no other word for the speed with which she disappeared from the chamber, her footsteps still silent even in panic. Dorian stood alone amid his scattered tools and damaged components, replaying the moment in his mind, trying to understand how something so instinctive could be so catastrophically wrong. She did not appear for 2 days. Dorian worked on his transmitter in solitude, the crystalline corridors echoing with a silence that felt heavier than before. Food and water still materialized outside his chamber each morning, evidence that she had not abandoned him entirely, but the containers appeared while he slept, and she was never there when he woke. The distance between them had grown from careful to absolute. He replayed the moment endlessly in his mind. The tremor, the stumble, his hand closing around her arm, fingers pressing against that cool gray skin for perhaps half a second before she tore herself away. Such a small thing, such an insignificant gesture by human standards. He had touched colleagues, friends, strangers on crowded transit platforms without a second thought. Touch was the background noise of human existence, unremarkable and constant. But she was not human, and the look in her eyes had not been surprise or discomfort. It had been fear. Genuine, visceral fear, as though his fingers had threatened something essential to her being. On the 3rd morning, Dorian decided that apologies required delivery regardless of whether they could be understood. He left his chamber before dawn, navigating the curving corridors by the soft blue glow of the ceiling panels, searching for any sign of her presence. The observatory was vast, far larger than he had initially realized, chambers branching into chambers in patterns that seemed to follow some logic he could not grasp. Star maps floated in empty rooms, galaxies spinning slowly in the darkness, waiting for observers who would never come. He found her in a chamber he had not seen before, deeper in the structure than he had previously ventured. She stood before a projection that showed a single star system in exquisite detail, planets orbiting in accelerated time, moons tracing their own smaller circles around worlds of blue and green and gold. Her back was to him, her silver-streaked hair falling past her shoulders, and the patterns across her visible skin pulsed in slow rhythms of deep violet. She knew he was there. Her long ears had angled toward the doorway before he even crossed the threshold. But she did not turn, did not flee, did not acknowledge his presence except for a slight tension in her shoulders that spoke louder than any words. Dorian stayed in the doorway. He had learned that much, at least. Distance mattered to her in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He spoke anyway, letting his voice fill the space between them with sounds she could not understand but might still somehow feel. He told her he was sorry. He told her he had not known, could not have known, that touch carried such weight for her people. He told her that where he came from, reaching out to steady someone was an act of care, of connection, of the simple human impulse to prevent another person from falling. He was not asking her to forgive him. He was only asking her to understand that harm had not been his intention. The star system continued its silent rotation. Planets swept through their orbits. Moons rose and set over worlds that existed only as light and mathematics. And slowly, gradually, the tension in her shoulders began to ease. She turned to face him, and he saw something in her violet eyes that had not been there before. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Her patterns shifted from deep violet to something softer, cooler, and she raised one hand in a gesture that seemed to indicate the projection behind her. A question. She was asking him something about the star system, about the worlds that spun in their careful dance around that distant sun. And Dorian realized with sudden clarity that this was her way of moving forward. Not through apology or explanation, but through the resumption of their strange half-communication. Through the act of sharing knowledge despite the barriers between them. He stepped into the chamber, maintaining the distance she required, and looked at the projection with genuine interest. The system was beautiful, clearly habitable, the kind of place that human colonists would have fought wars to claim. Multiple worlds capable of supporting life, resources abundant enough to sustain civilizations for millennia. A paradise of astronomical proportions. And then he noticed the date stamp floating in the corner of the projection. Numbers in a format he did not recognize, but context suggested meaning. This was not a current observation. This was a record, historical data preserved from some distant past. The star system no longer existed, or no longer existed in this form. He knew this with sudden terrible certainty, reading the truth in the way Xylith watched the spinning worlds, in the deep violet of her patterns, in the weight of centuries that seemed to press down upon her slender frame. This was her home, the world where her people had evolved, had built their civilization, had learned to speak in light and map the spaces between stars. And it was gone now, lost to time or catastrophe, or simply the inevitable entropy that claimed all things eventually. She was not merely alone in this observatory. She was alone in the universe, the last speaker of a silent language, the final keeper of memories that no one else remembered. Dorian wanted to reach out to her. The impulse was overwhelming, almost physical in its intensity. He wanted to offer comfort the only way humans knew how, through presence and proximity and the simple pressure of another body against her own. But he held himself still, respecting the boundary she had established, and instead he simply stood beside her in the shifting light of her lost home and hoped that his presence was enough. They remained there for a long time, watching worlds that no longer existed trace their paths around a star that had perhaps gone dark centuries ago. The silence between them was different now, less about incompatibility and more about shared understanding. Some things did not require translation. The days that followed marked a shift in their relationship. The distance remained, that careful mathematical spacing that she maintained with unconscious precision, but the tension within it had changed. She began seeking him out as he worked, watching his repairs with something that approached genuine interest. Her patterns would pulse with questions he learned to interpret through context and repetition. Blue for curiosity, green for approval, a particular shade of amber that seemed to indicate amusement when he made mistakes. Dorian discovered that she found human inefficiency entertaining. His clumsy fingers, adapted for tools rather than the elegant gesture language of her people. His need for food and water at regular intervals rather than the apparently optional sustenance she required. His habit of talking to his equipment when it refused to cooperate, which seemed to particularly fascinate her. Once, when he spent 15 minutes cursing at a recalcitrant circuit board, her patterns flickered through a sequence that he could have sworn was laughter. She began teaching him things in return for his inadvertent comedy. The observatory contained technologies that made his damaged transmitter look like something carved from stone, and she showed him principles of energy manipulation and wave propagation that exceeded anything in the human scientific corpus. He could not replicate her techniques, lacking both the biological capacity and the millennia of accumulated knowledge, but he could adapt. He could take the fragments he understood and apply them to his crude human equipment. The transmitter began to take shape under their combined efforts. Not his original device, not anymore, but something hybrid. Human engineering married to alien principles in ways that should not have worked but somehow did. Xylith would indicate modifications through gesture and pulsing light, and Dorian would translate her intentions into physical changes, often requiring multiple attempts before he understood what she wanted. They developed a rhythm, a partnership, something that felt almost like friendship, though he could not be certain she understood the concept. And through it all, the boundary remained. She never touched him, he never touched her. They moved through the same spaces, worked on the same equipment, shared the same silences, but always with that precise distance maintained between their bodies. Dorian found himself hyper-aware of it, conscious of every near approach. Every moment when reaching out would have been so easy. He kept his hands to himself and pretended it did not feel like a kind of loss. One evening, as the twin suns began their descent and the crystalline walls erupted into cascades of fractured color, Xylith led him to a chamber he had never entered. Shelves lined the walls, filled with objects he could not identify, artifacts from a civilization that had scattered to the stellar winds. She selected something from a high shelf and brought it to a table where the light could catch it properly. It was a container, small, elegant, made from material that shifted color as it moved. She opened it with careful reverence and tilted it toward him so he could see the contents. Dark powder. Granular, slightly oily in appearance, with an aroma that rose to meet him as she opened the lid. An aroma that was somehow, impossibly, achingly familiar. Coffee, or something close enough to coffee that his brain refused to acknowledge the difference. She had been paying attention. All those rambling monologues about human necessities, all those jokes about civilization collapsing without proper caffeine delivery, and she had remembered. She had searched through the artifacts of her lost people and found something that might serve, and she was offering it to him with patterns of soft, warm gold pulsing across her skin. Dorian stared at the container, then at her face, then back at the container. His throat felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the thin atmosphere his suit filtered for him. She had given him a gift. She had crossed some invisible line within herself to offer him this small kindness. And he could not even thank her properly, because words meant nothing and touch was forbidden, and all he had was the expression on his face, the moisture gathering in his eyes, the helpless smile that spread across his features despite his best efforts to contain it. Her patterns flickered with uncertainty, then warmed as she read whatever she could read in his human reactions. Understanding passed between them, imperfect but real. Some things truly did not require translation. The transmitter hummed with power it had never possessed before. Hybrid circuitry glowing faintly with patterns that echoed the bioluminescence Dorian had grown so accustomed to watching. 3 weeks of work had transformed his crude human equipment into something elegant, something that bridged the gap between technologies separated by millennia of divergent evolution. He ran his fingers along the casing and felt the warmth of energy waiting to be released. Tonight, he would send his signal. Tonight, after 18 days of silence, his voice would reach out across the void, and someone might finally answer. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he found himself standing at the window of his borrowed chamber, watching the twin suns paint the frozen sea in shades of amber and rose, and feeling something that sat uncomfortably close to reluctance. The observatory had become familiar in ways he had not anticipated. The curving corridors that once seemed labyrinthine now felt like paths worn comfortable by repetition. The soft blue glow of the ceiling panels had replaced the harsh artificial lights of spacecraft in his visual vocabulary of safety. And Xylith, the gray-skinned keeper of forgotten stars, had become something he could not easily name, but knew he would miss with an intensity that surprised him. She found him there as the first sun touched the horizon, her footsteps silent as always, her presence announced only by the soft pulse of light across his peripheral vision. He had learned to sense her approach through other means now, through the subtle shift in the air, through some awareness that had developed during their weeks of proximity. She stood at the distance she always maintained, her violet eyes reflecting the sunset colors that flooded through the crystalline walls, and her patterns cycled through shades he had come to recognize as contemplation. Dorian turned to face her, and the words he had prepared dissolved into uselessness. What could he say? Thank you seemed inadequate. Goodbye seemed impossible. The language barrier that had defined their relationship from the beginning loomed larger than ever now that it threatened to become permanent. She moved toward the star-mapped chamber, a gesture that had become invitation, and he followed as he always did. But tonight she did not stop at the usual displays, the rotating galaxies and orbital projections that had filled so many of their shared hours. Tonight she led him deeper, to a map he had never seen, a projection that showed not the distant past but the present configuration of local space. His distress beacon coordinates pulsed at the center of the display. And there, moving slowly but unmistakably toward Verath 9, a cluster of signals that his trained eye immediately recognized. Ships, rescue vessels responding to his beacon, still days away but coming nonetheless. She had known. Of course she had known. Her technology could detect things his equipment could only dream of, and she had watched his salvation approach without telling him, without giving any indication that his time here had a definite end. He looked at her, searching for understanding in those violet depths, and found something that made his chest constrict. Her patterns were cycling through colors he had never seen before, slow waves of deep blue and silver that seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath her skin, rather than across its surface. This was not curiosity or amusement or the careful neutral tones she usually maintained. This was something raw, something she had perhaps never felt before, something that her people's evolution toward lightspeed communication had not prepared her to process. She was afraid, not of him, not anymore, but of something else entirely, of the emptiness that would return when he was gone, of the silence that had been her companion for centuries and would be her companion again, of the way this strange, loud creature had somehow made her observatory feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Dorian understood because he felt it too, that peculiar grief for a loss that had not yet occurred. He had crashed on this moon expecting to die, and instead he had found something he had not known he was missing: connection, purpose, the simple profound comfort of another consciousness sharing space with his own, even across barriers that should have made such sharing impossible. The twin suns continued their descent, and the crystalline walls erupted into their evening display of fractured light. Rainbows cascaded across every surface, transforming the chamber into a cathedral of color that seemed to celebrate and mourn simultaneously. Xylith stood in the center of it all, her gray skin catching the light, her silver-streaked hair glowing with reflected fire, and her patterns pulsing with that deep, slow rhythm of unnamed emotion. Her shoulders began to tremble. It was slight at first, barely perceptible, a vibration that might have been attributed to the building settling or the temperature dropping as night approached. But Dorian had spent weeks learning to read her body when her light language remained opaque, and he recognized the trembling for what it was. Something inside her was breaking loose, some dam of centuries-old control finally giving way under the pressure of feelings she had no framework to contain. He did not think. He did not consider the consequences or the boundaries or the fear she had shown when he touched her before. He simply crossed the distance between them and wrapped his arms around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest with a gentleness that belied the desperation beneath it. She went rigid in his embrace, every muscle locked, every pattern frozen in that alarmed crimson-white flare that had haunted him since the first time. He felt her prepare to flee, to wrench herself away as she had done before, to retreat into the safety of isolation that had protected her for so long. But she did not flee. Instead, slowly, with movements that spoke of someone navigating entirely unknown territory, her hands rose from her sides and pressed against his back. Her fingers spread across his shoulder blades, uncertain, trembling, feeling the shape of human contact for the first time in her existence. The patterns across her skin shifted from alarm through confusion through something that might have been wonder, cycling faster than he had ever seen them move before settling finally into a color he did not recognize. Warm, soft. The color of light filtered through honey, of amber sunsets, of something precious finally found after a lifetime of searching. She did not understand what was happening inside her chest. He could feel that incomprehension in the way she held him, experimental and reverent, as though he were an artifact from a lost civilization that she was cataloging for the first time. Her people had evolved beyond this. They had decided somewhere in their distant past that physical contact was primitive, unnecessary, a distraction from the purity of light-based communication. They had forgotten what bodies could say to each other through simple proximity. But Xylith was remembering now. Or perhaps not remembering but discovering, learning something entirely new about the vessel she had inhabited for centuries without truly knowing. Her face pressed against his shoulder, her breath warmed through the fabric of his suit, and she made a sound that startled them both. A sigh, soft and wondering and completely involuntary. She could make sounds. She had simply never had reason to, never found anything worth breaking her silence for. But this, apparently, qualified. This warranted the primitive vibration of air through vocal cords that her ancestors had abandoned. This feeling, this impossible warmth spreading through her chest, demanded expression in ways that light could not provide. Dorian held her as the suns completed their descent, and darkness claimed the frozen sea below. He held her as the stars emerged, unfamiliar constellations wheeling overhead, the same stars she had spent centuries mapping in solitude. He held her until his arms ached, and his legs grew tired, and still, he did not let go because she had not asked him to, and he was not certain he could even if she did. The transmitter sat waiting in his workspace, ready to send his voice across the void. Ships approached through the darkness, rescue mere days away. His life before this moon waited to reclaim him, the routines and responsibilities and relationships that had defined his existence before a crash landing changed everything. But in this moment, in this chamber of fractured light and ancient star maps, none of that mattered. What mattered was the woman in his arms, the last keeper of forgotten knowledge, finally learning what her people had forgotten. What mattered was the way her patterns had settled into that warm honey glow and showed no sign of changing. What mattered was the truth neither of them could speak, but both understood with perfect clarity. She did not want him to let go. And so he did not. He stood in the darkness of an alien observatory, holding a being from a species that had forgotten how to touch, and he made a decision that would reshape both their futures. The rescue ships could wait. The signal could wait. Everything could wait until she was ready to release him, however long that took. Some things were worth more than rescue. Some connections transcended the barriers of species and language and the vast cold distances between stars. In some moments, Dorian realized, were not about going home, but about discovering that home had found you in the most unexpected place imaginable. Outside, the twin moons of Vareth 9 primary planet rose over the frozen sea, casting silver light across a landscape of crystal and ice. Inside, two beings